Old colloquium. So we have a wonderful speaker to kick off this small series. Dr. Fedorenko is here, visiting us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she has appointments at Harvard and MIT, better than Cambridge. So for those of you who are in the neurobiology language area, I'm sure you're familiar with her work. Ed does very interesting work on neurobiology language, in particular getting at what is domain general in language processing and is more domain specific, and where domain specificity in language might actually intersect with things like music or other kinds of sequential processing. So she's made some significant contributions in this area, which is a difficult area to address and requires both theoretical and methodological work. And Ev has made some great contributions to both of those aspects. We did her methodological development at FMI, and let her tell you about her most recent work. Welcome, Ev.
Thank you for having me here. It's very nice. I've never been to UConn before. It seems like a great place and a great community. Okay, I'm fine with interruptions. I don't know what style you guys usually do for a colloquium, but I'm happy to interrupt anytime. All right, so I'll start by just situating us a little bit in language, although I get that a lot of people here work on language, but just to do a little bit of this, so we can have linguistic input come in through our ears or our eyes if we're reading or processing sign language. Then on the side of language comprehension, we interpret the input with respect to some stored knowledge representations, the nature of which is one of the big debated questions in the field. How abstract are those representations? What form do they take? Are they composed of rules, abstract rules and words? Are they more kind of consistent with usage-based accounts, where there's a continuum from smaller to larger units, not necessarily broken down by type of unit? And so that's happening on the side of language comprehension. And on the side of language production, we use presumably the same set of knowledge representations to generate utterances in our heads, and then we can send them down to some output modality, like a set of articulators, or our motor system if we're gesturing, producing sign language via gesture, or typing or writing in spoken languages. So we now know that there is distinct sets of computations and correspondingly distinct chunks of the brain that correspond to these different boxes. The machinery that we have for speech perception and visual reading perception are exquisitely specific, so there's parts of our auditory cortex that respond just to speech, but not to things like music, animal noises, other kinds of vocalizations, non-speech vocalizations. And there's some parts of our visual cortex that respond to letters in the script that we're familiar with, but not to faces or objects or scene layouts or numerals or other things like that. On the speech of language production, things are less specialized, so it seems like we use our motor cortical circuits both for producing speech, but also for doing other things with our mouths, like making kissy noise or sticking our tongue out. And presumably that's kind of in line with the proposed topography organized by the articulators and their states, which of course can be used for many different things. And then in the middle is this red box, which is, I find the most exciting, which is I think of as the interface basically between thoughts and this mode that we have, which allows us to translate thoughts so that we can share them with each other, right? A lot of animals have quite complex thought, but one thing that they're lacking is a system that can allow them to share arbitrarily complex messages with one another. And as humans, we can do this. So I basically spent the last few years trying to make a mini tiny dent in trying to understand the representations that support language comprehension and production, and the kinds of computations that might be engaged when we do this. And these are very hard questions to get at, so I often give an example from the field of vision research where there is animal physiology data, and even in those domains where there is access to much, I don't know if you want to call it better data. I mean, I think it's in some ways better data. People are only really now in the last few years getting to the point where they're starting to have kind of mechanistic level explanations of what it might take to recognize an object, to recognize a face. And this is done through a combination of imaging work in animals combined with cellular physiology work and some modeling work to go along with that. So because these questions are hard, what the approach that I'm taking, a lot of people are also taking, is trying to get some traction on questions that are more tractable, that are more tangible, that you can then try to use to constrain theorizing about the actual computations and representations that underlie language. So I kind of see my research program as being composed into a few directions, and I'll just mention them briefly, and then I'll talk about one of them primarily today, but I'm happy to answer questions about other things in the question period. So the first question basically probes language as part of the broader mind and brain architecture that we have. So language is a very evolutionarily late development, and it came about against the backdrop of a lot of stuff that was already in place, like the memory and attention structures, the social cognition mechanisms, the motor and perceptual circuits. So the question is, when it came about, did it co-opt bits and pieces of existing machineries? Did it make a niche of itself, for itself in the mind and brain? And to the extent, regardless of the answer to that question, how does whatever machinery we use for language interact with other things? Of course, there's no walls around language. I don't think anybody these days argues for very strong Fedorian notions of modularity, where something is a universe in and of itself without interacting with the rest of the cognitive machinery we have. And so the question is, given that most complex tasks in the natural world require many complex mechanisms to process, how, for example, do our language mechanisms interact with our social cognition mechanism when we're making pragmatic inferences about what somebody wants from us when they're talking to us, right? Which is above and beyond just kind of getting the raw meaning from the signal. Okay, the questions having to do with internal architecture basically probe the organization of this broad set of regions that are active when we produce and understand language in both space and time. So asking things like, do different parts of the language system do different aspects of language? And to the extent that they do or don't, do different linguistic processes happen at different distinct time points during comprehension and production? And I think that set of questions perhaps has the most promise for understanding what the language regions actually do that allow enable comprehension production. The third line of work explores the variability that we have with respect to the neural architecture of language. So I'll talk for a couple of slides about the methodological foundation for this work. And I spent a few years trying to circumvent the variability that we have across our brains to be able to pull signals from what we think are plausibly corresponding functional regions. But now that we've gotten there, we can also explore the variability that is very obvious to anybody who looks at individual activation maps, and there are things that that pop out at you very obviously, like for example, some people's language systems are very left lateralized. Other people have more bilateral representations. We know that that's bound to be important in some ways because any developmental disorder that has been described anywhere tends to have more bilateral language activation. So clearly something goes not quite right developmentally that tends to lead to more bilateral language representations. And so in this line of work, in collaboration with Simon Fisher, we're trying to relate the variability in these kinds of features of language activations to genetic variability in the genes that have been linked to brain development based on the disorders literature. And on the other hand, we're trying to relate neural variability to behavior to try to understand whether some properties of our language activations, like how robust the signal is or how extensive the regions are, whether that's related to something like being good at language, whatever the hell that may mean. That may mean many different things, and we're trying to formalize that as well a little bit, but whether basically to some advantages in language. Right. Said that, and then this is also where our work on language and various disorders falls in, like autism. We have a big line of work on autism research. And then the fourth thing has to do with plasticity, and there's kind of two sides there. So one has to do with reorganization following brain damage. So brains get damaged in many different ways for many different reasons, and things don't stay stable. Even in adults, there's a lot of things happening post brain resection or stroke or trauma. I'm interested in understanding how different systems, especially the very domain general systems we have that support executive functions, how those systems might help aid recovery of some of the more specialized processes. And then there's also a relatively newer line of work trying to understand effects of expertise in high-level cognition. So sometimes we have unusually extensive experiences in some parts of high-level cognition, like we may be an actor, and so we may have extra demands on our social machinery to try to convey mental states to others, or we may be a hyper-polyglot and able to learn many, many mappings onto between concepts and forms, or we may be a writer who spends days in and out trying to think of the right way to express a thought in a particular message. And so I'm interested in understanding how these different kinds of experiences in these high-level domains above and beyond kind of sensory and motor training, which is what most people have looked at so far, how that changes either the specific networks that observe those abilities, how might it change the global architecture of the brain, and so on and so forth. And we use a whole bunch of tools to look at this. So I've used fMRI a lot, largely because the questions that I started with had to do with the left quadrant, and for those questions, fMRI was a really good method to tackle things. For other questions, it's not necessarily the best method, and so we've expanded. I mean, I've always been doing behavioral work as well, but we also do some EEG work, both extracranially and in patients undergoing brain surgery, including stimulation in those patients as well to get at causal questions. And like I mentioned, we're looking at some work on genetic disorders or genetic variability in the typical population as well. Okay, so I'll spend this talk, I'll say 2 words about the left quadrant, and then I'll spend most of the time talking about the internal architecture question, because I think it might resonate with quite a few people here in this community. Or might be interesting and not resonate at all, but hopefully at least it'll spark some discussion. Okay, so before going to the content, I want to spend just a few minutes doing my methodological shtick, because I think it's important. Basically, the problem is this. So whenever we do science, most of the time we're trying to make generalizations about the population. There are some questions for which we actually do care about the variability, and we're trying to characterize individuals to the extent that there are stable properties of individuals over time. But mostly we want to say, humans have this property X. And in behavioral work, it's really quite straightforward to average data together, like average reaction times or whatever measure you might have. But averaging brains is really challenging because brains are different. This is just a picture of a template, so it's not different. But normally, if you look at real human brains, you'll notice that from the very kind of coarse level anatomy with the sulci and gyri to things we can't see on the surface, but to things that people like Gerbinian Brodmann and others who have been doing site architectonic analysis could see, where patches of cells with different properties land in slightly different locations relative to the folds of the brain. And these kinds of things make the averaging of brains, which is what people have been doing in a lot of cognitive neuroscience work, really problematic. And so the standard approach is to basically try to align brains in some 3D brain space, right? So you take either a particular brain as a template, or you take an average of a bunch of brains as a template, and then for each new person whose data you acquire, you align them to that template, and then you assume that in each point in that space, you've now have functional correspondence across brains. So that's the kind of standard approach that people do, and like I said, this is problematic. And as a result, not surprisingly, if you look at the variability of functional activations, things don't align very well. And it's not so bad if you look at, for example, primary visual regions. So primary visual cortical activations align pretty well with the calcar and sulcus. As you move away into the association cortices, like the temporal cortex, the parietal cortex, the frontal cortex, things are really pretty bad. And so this leads to problems. And there's kind of two levels of problems. There's technical issues where sometimes you miss things. So this is the issue of limited sensitivity. So you can have a region that everybody has, and it's in slightly different locations. And then when you have average things, in any given point, you don't have enough subjects contributing to that point, so that at the group level you see nothing. This is not a made-up problem, so one of the very well-characterized brain regions is the fusiform face area, the FFA. That region you can't see in most group analysis. You just get a blank ventral surface, so there's nothing, even though each person has a very robust face region there. Another problem, which is, so this is bad. Another problem is what I call limited functional resolution. So this is a problem that can affect questions that I began my work in this field in, which is asking whether two mental computations rely on the same underlying machinery. Again, you can imagine that you have two brain regions that happen to be nearby that are completely non-overlapping and do different things. Let's say one does language and one does music, for the sake of an example. And in one person they're like this, and another person they're like this, another person they're like this. And so if you average things in each point in space, you will be drawing some data from, in each point you're drawing data from some subjects who may have, say, a language region, and in some subjects that may be a music region. At the group level you get a blob that responds to both manipulations, and that completely gives you the wrong answer about the underlying architecture. That's not good. But I think those are actually not the worst things. I think the most challenging thing that this kind of standard approach faces is that it's really hard to connect findings to each other across studies, which I would think is kind of a desirable thing to do. We want to build on each other's work, and we want to know how to compare things across studies. And basically the output that you get from this analysis where you average brains together is a set of XYZ coordinates. So you look at some syntactic manipulation, and you find syntax in a bunch of different places, and you report these long tables of XYZ coordinates, and you characterize them in terms of very, very coarse level anatomy, right? So you say, I found activation within the inferior frontal gyrus, or the superior temporal gyrus, or something like that. And these are very, very large chunks of cortex. So from that, it follows that if you have two studies that have looked at two different things and report activation in the inferior frontal gyrus, it does not follow that those two manipulations rely on the same machinery, because it may very well be the case that they're arising from nearby regions, and the only way to resolve this is to do those two relevant manipulations in the same population, and I would argue actually in the same person, if you really want to know whether there is overlap or not. And so what's an alternative? So the alternative basically conceptually comes from the animal physiology literature, where instead of simply sticking electrodes in some part of the brain and starting to record, what you normally do is you implant your electrodes, and then you test responses to some basic functional responses of those cells that you're now tapping, right, to make sure that you have responses to your paradigm. And so the analogy in fMRI is basically to combine anatomical constraints. So you certainly don't want to average somebody's frontal and somebody's temporal region, but so you use some anatomical constraints, but then you combine that with some functional property that's relevant to whatever it is that you're studying, be it a greater response to faces than objects, or greater response to music than other kinds of sounds, or greater response to, say, meaningful and structured language compared to some perceptually matched linguistically degraded control condition. So this is effectively what we've been doing. And we typically use either a contrast between sentences and sequences of non-words to find regions that are sensitive to, what I often say kind of high-level language processing, which means kind of dealing with understanding word meanings and putting them together into complex representations. Any contrast between a linguistic stimulus and a linguistically degraded control will give you these regions. So this contrast is incredibly robust, so you can use speech versus backward speech, you can use speech versus foreign speech, you can use sentences versus lists of words. All of these contrasts will give you the same set of regions. And these activations are highly stable. They're variable across people slightly. They're very stable within a person. So here's just a sample of 5 brains with 2 sessions, which vary in time between a few weeks and a few years. So I can bring you in today, and I can bring you back 10 years from now in your language system. Well, with aging, things start to happen, but they don't necessarily affect the stability of those activations. They may affect some other global properties of the brain, but the topography of the language system is incredibly stable. I think the biggest difference we have in our data set of now over 600 people is like, maybe 7 or 8 years apart, and at least for those intervals it looks very, very stable. So that gives hope to a lot of individual differences. That suggests that there is some stable variability there to tap to try to relate it to behavior on the one hand and potentially genetics on the other hand. Okay, and I'll mention one more thing. As part of trying to get people to look beyond Dutch and English and German, which is what most cognitive neuroscience has been done on in the last 10-15 years. We have a project where we've developed localizers for now over 40 languages, spanning 10 different language families. We call it the Alice project just because we use Alice in Wonderland-based materials to do this. And this is all now publicly available, and we're just getting ready to submit a paper which shows that they all work across these different languages, and it's a robust tool. And not only my hope is that not only does it allow us to look at some linguistic properties that you just can't get access to in English and German and Dutch, or even like Hebrew and Japanese, right? There's languages that have some very interesting features of morphology or verb initiality or something like that, which are just not present in the languages commonly studied. But I'm hoping that eventually we can also do these cross-language, cross-family comparisons, asking questions like, does your language system end up looking differently if you learn a language that relies on something like word order as opposed to something like morphological markers on words to form dependencies, right? Those are two very different solutions to composing complex meanings, and I think there's interesting questions there that haven't been asked before. Okay, so now on to the content. So I'll say just one slide about the specificity. So that's where I got started, and I was drawn into this field by, into this part of the field by claims that we have an abstract hierarchical processor in our brains that can handle things like language, but also things like music and maybe complex action perception, or maybe other domains that have this property of hierarchically structured representations. There were some claims in the literature about such a thing existing, and so I wanted to evaluate, and so basically I looked at a bunch of domains that people said share some computational demands with language to see if there's overlap, and so we've looked at things varying from arithmetic to executive functions to action and gesture perception to music perception to conceptual processing that is non-linguistic, like in silent films or something like that, and social cognition. I've mostly used fMRI to look at these at this question, and then I kind of got started collaborating with a researcher, Rosemary Barley, who's been studying global aphasics for the last bunch of years. And it's a very interesting population that most aphasia researchers haven't studied because those are severely impaired individuals. They're very hard to work with. They basically, unlike your standard kind of Broca's non-fluent aphasics or kind of Wernicke's fluent aphasics, these people not just have a problem with one or the other production or comprehension or syntax or some aspects of word retrieval, they have kind of no language left effectively. They sometimes have very minimal lexical access for some common words, but they really are linguistically lacking. And they are hard to work with, but they allow us to ask this really fundamental question, like what kind of complex thought is possible once you lose language as an adult, right? Which is a big, important question. And there's certainly some people, including some current philosophers, who argue that language is actually has to be present in your mind to have complex thought. And it turns out that that's not true. So the picture that has emerged from these efforts is that in fMRI we find that regions that respond a lot to language show little or no response to a lot of these non-linguistic tasks. And similarly, patients with global aphasia seem to be just fine on anything that doesn't have to do with language, as long as you can get the task demands across, and you have to be a clever experimentalist to work with this population. But some things are really trivial. You can get them to do a bunch of math problems, right, including math problems where ordering of elements matters. they're perfectly fine, no problems. You can get them to do kind of thumbs up, thumbs down judgments on musical, on structured pieces of music where there is or isn't a violation of tonal structure, and they detect those just fine. Anyway, so the bottom line, it seems like the regions that support language processing are quite specialized for interpreting and generating linguistic messages. And it doesn't seem like such a thing as something like an abstract hierarchical structure processor exists anywhere. Okay, so a couple things that there are non-implications of this, which sometimes are taken to be implications of this, and then people get upset, but they shouldn't. One thing is that it certainly does not follow from this that the language system is innate in any way. In fact, the way that I've already kind of alluded to it is, I think of the language system as a store of our linguistic knowledge that obviously we acquire through our experience with the world. We know from the existence of regions that I mentioned in passing at the very beginning, namely regions in on the ventral visual surface that specialize for processing letters in your familiar script, right? So there is something that will specialize for processing Latin letters for you, but not, say, Hebrew letters if you're not familiar with the Hebrew script. And the existence of such a region pretty clearly suggests that this is experientially driven specificity, so it's something like, you have to learn to read. There's a bunch of these little weird looking things that are all kind of similar. They're made up of these kind of strokes, and presumably to be able to distinguish between them, it seems like it's an efficient thing to dedicate some chunk of the visual cortex to process those symbols. So my bias is to think that the higher level language regions that I have focused on are also experientially driven, although it's, I'm certainly not opposed to the idea that there's something innate. It's just my bias is to not postulate any innate constraints unless there's very, very strong evidence to do so. Because in biology there's not that many breaks in the continuity of evolution of things, and so I really like work by Susanna Herklana-Hausel suggesting that our brains really are not qualitatively different from other primates. They're just scaled up versions of those, which makes a lot of intuitive sense to me. Right, the fact that, again, so this is related, the fact that we have these brain regions that happen to specialize for language processing did not necessarily have to evolve for language. In fact, there's a lot of debate about which aspect of our experience, which pressures drove the expansion of our association cortices, like whether it came from the evolution of more complex tools, from the expansion of our social structures where we interact with more individuals in more complex ways. I certainly don't think there's evidence one way or another. Maybe there never will be. Evolutionary stuff is often speculatory, but it certainly does not follow. And then this point I already made that, of course, even if it even responds, even if it has very strongly preferred stimuli, it doesn't mean that this language system doesn't interact with other parts of the brain. Okay. Now on to the internal architecture of the language system. So just some things I already mentioned. So we have this set of brain regions that respond a lot when we understand language. These regions no longer care whether the information came in through the auditory channel or the visual channel. They just care about the meaningfulness of the signal and interpreting it with respect to the relevant knowledge representations. And like I said, they seem like they're selective for language over various other non-linguistic functions. And we've known for many years from the stimulation work, resection work, and aphasia that they seem causally important in language. So if you damage the system, things tend to go wrong. If you damage it in adulthood, damage in childhood, anything goes. It's fine, you recover, and you're going to be fine. So what we don't know, I think, still is what the internal structure of this system looks like. There's, as you can see, there's quite extensive machinery, and there's some homologs in the right hemisphere that are active when we process language. So the question is, are there organizing principles to this neural activity? Are there different chunks that do really different things, pay attention to different parts of the linguistic signal? I think there's proposals out there, but I don't think there's clarity that has emerged. And there's a bunch of challenges to asking these questions with the methods that people most commonly use. So for fMRI, a big challenge is that these regions have been shown to be very strongly integrated with each other. So if you just have people do nothing for a few minutes, and you take a time course of up and down activity pattern from some part of the system, you can predict really well the up and down pattern in another part of the system, suggesting that whatever these different parts of the system do, they're doing it together, they're co-oscillating together, which makes it really hard to find associations then. And of course, you know, the well-known problem with fMRI is that these signals we measure are on the order of a few seconds delayed relative to the onset of the neural activity, and so it's hard to dissociate things in time as well. And with patient studies, so aphasia is commonly used to make claims about the internal structure. Lesions are often large. They don't care about functional boundaries. They just go where blood vessels are. They often affect white matter tracts as well. And they are idiosyncratic and also followed by recovery and reorganization. So it's hard to make inferences between dissociations such that one brain region supports this aspect of language, another brain region supports another aspect of language. And yet people, you know, it doesn't always stop people from making sometimes really strong claims about how some parts of this activation landscape support distinct aspects of language. So what does language consist of? So now, here I'm talking about the literal interpretation of the signal. Of course, there's a whole layer on top of this having to do with using social information to try to reason about other people's minds and making pragmatic inferences. But here we're just talking about mapping a string of words onto an internal meaning representation. So as in any domain, in language we have a set of communicative signals, set of knowledge representations, which I already mentioned include things like the sounds of the language, the words, some information about how words and morphemes can combine to make new complex meanings. And in early linguistic proposals, including Chomsky's early work, the idea was that the way we combine words to form phrases and sentences is through a set of really abstract rules that operate over things like syntactic categories. So like a sentence is made up of a noun phrase or a verb phrase, or an adjective is made up of a determiner and an adjective. And then it very quickly became clear that that level of abstractness is not very good for capturing the richness of human language, meaning that many words have a lot of idiosyncrasy to how they combine with other words, and so something like a category of a verb is not going to take you very far. And this also became clear in parallel developments in computational linguistics, where people started trying to build parsers, and things that didn't include word level information just were doing abysmally bad. So anyway, so eventually there was a shift to basically store information about how a word or a morpheme can combine with other elements as part of that word's knowledge. So this is known as a lexicalization of grammar. So in pretty much all current linguistic proposals, grammars are highly lexicalized, and the machinery that's used to combine things to form complex phrases and sentences had been reduced to a minimum. So it's known in the Chomskyan tradition as merge. You can call it whatever else, but basically the idea is the same basic operation is used to combine any two elements to make a new complex representation. Okay, so given that there's still the separation between the stored representations and the combinatorial machinery, even with the whole lexicalization of grammars and really complex, rich word-level representations that have information about how things combine with each other, it still makes sense to ask a question whether there is some parts of the language system that primarily focus on the combinatorial component and other parts that deal with storing the bulk of the language knowledge that we have. And in the literature, this question is sometimes cast as basically the distinction between lexico-semantic processing the meanings of words, phrases, and syntactic processing, so processing the combinatorial operations that are used to combine these. Okay, so like a cartoon for illustrating this, the way I think about it is basically it's asking whether our language system is more like this, right, where we have a bunch of bricks in some construction site, and then some dude way elsewhere, maybe in Broca's area, maybe not, who occasionally comes and puts these bricks together, or whether it's something like where you have a bunch of bricks lying around and you can kind of turn around and put any two bricks together in a flexible manner. You maybe are detecting some bias for how you think, I think this works. Anyway, so what's the evidence for that we have for these dissociations, so, or lack thereof? So, as I briefly mentioned, one contrast that you can use to find this broad set of language activations is a contrast between things like phrases or sentences. Oh, I guess I'm not quite in the right order, and a set of non-words, so or backward speech or something like this. And of course, non-words lacks both word-level meanings and structure, right? It's just basically some sound-level representations. And so, in an attempt to tease these two dimensions apart, the word-level meanings and structure, a few people have used paradigms like these, where you basically have a 2x2 design, where sentences have both word-level meanings and combinatorics, non-words have neither, and then the in-between conditions, wordless have word-level meanings but no structure, and Jabberwocky sentences have some core structure, maybe very primitive meaning, but cannot be interpreted with respect to our world knowledge. And so the question is whether any regions are selectively or at least preferentially responding to lexical information or combinatorial information. So if something responds more to word-level meanings, you would expect that sentences and word lists would be high and conditions that don't have real words would be low. If it's something like structure, you would expect that sentences and Jabberwocky sentences, which have some structure, would be high and the other two conditions would be low. And regions that have those profiles do not exist in the human brain. So the profile that you get very uniformly across this whole fronto-temporal network is this gradient profile where sentences elicit the strongest response, the in-between conditions elicit intermediate response, and non-words elicit the lowest response, backward speech goes even lower. So there is basically some gradation that you can think of as basically the better you match the statistical properties of the language, the higher the response. I mean, that's one operationalization of that pattern. But you may say, well, maybe the reason you're not seeing this dissociation is because you constrain things to this broad set of cortical regions that you define with this very coarse contrast between sentences and non-words. So maybe there is some dissociations that are happening at a fine-grained structure of small bits interleaved, and I would have been perfectly happy with that, but that also doesn't happen. So what you can do, for example, is you can search forget averaging across voxels at all. Treat each voxel as its whole universe, this little piece of the activation landscape. Search for voxels that show a preference for word-level processing or syntactic processing, and then see if that pattern is stable between two halves of your data. And if it is, then you have some semblance of a dissociation, and you generally don't. So you really find that even at the level of fine-grained activation patterns, you find that anything that responds to word meanings also responds more when you have something like sentences, so when you have a structured representation. Okay, I would say that this picture is not consistent with selectivity for lexical, semantic, or combinatorial processing, and instead all regions seem to care about both. So you may say, well, maybe, again, maybe these manipulations are just too crude, and you have to kind of go into finer grained manipulations to try to pull things apart. And so we've done that. So we've taken kind of standard paradigms from the literature that very specifically aim to tax to a greater extent lexico-semantic demands or structural demands. So things like, for example, violations of structure versus lexico-semantic expectations, right, where you have an unexpected word meaning-wise or unexpected word that violates the syntactic context. You can look at adaptation or adaptation recovery. So you can imagine repeating some aspects of the signal there that are either the same words or the same structure. In this particular paradigm is adaptation recovery. So instead of the gray condition where the same sentence is repeated, you have a sentence which uses the same words but changes the structure, so like an active-passive alternation or double object prepositional phrase object alternation. And in the first case, you use the same structure and words that are synonymous but distinct. So the author finished the novel, the writer completed the book.
And then there's a paradigm from Depreto and Buchheimer's classic paper published in Neuron in '99, where you get pairs of sentences and you have to decide whether they mean the same thing or not. And they either vary in their structural aspects or in their semantic aspects. So in red, you have cases where one word is replaced by a synonym or by a non-synonym, so for same and different judgment. And in the structural manipulation, you either have a syntactic alternation or something where the roles are switched, where you get a different meaning as a result. And basically, I already mentioned the approach. So you find, so this is just showing two sample regions, an inferior frontal and a posterior temporal regions, but really things look pretty uniformly the same across the whole frontotemporal landscape. And you find that all of these regions are sensitive to these manipulations, so you can find sensitivity to violation versus a control that ends expectedly. And some regions show a slight bias towards lexico-semantic violations. There is no part of the language network that shows a bias towards structural violations or structural adaptation or making judgments based on the structural sentence being the same or not. So that's that. So then I thought, okay, well maybe we can find some, I really wanted to find these dissociations because I spent a lot of time and effort trying to, because so many people argue that such a dissociation exists, and so if that's true, then that's like a fundamental part of what how our language system is structured, and it would be good to know. So then I thought, okay, maybe we need to go to methods that are more temporally sensitive, and maybe we can see something in how the time courses unfold for processing these different kinds of information or something like that. And so we did, we used ECOG, which is recordings from the surface of the brain in patients who undergo brain surgery, usually for epilepsy, occasionally for tumors. And you basically implant grids, and you record while patients do different tasks. And so here's a response profile from electrodes that show some sensitivity to language. So they show responses, strongest responses to sentences, next responses to lists of words, then Jabberwocky and non-words. So actually in ECOG, you get this, for the two intermediate conditions, you almost always see this bias towards word lists over Jabberwocky, which is not always apparent in fMRIs, but those are sometimes kind of even and in between. But in ECOG, you find a similar pattern and no individual channels that show, for example, selectivity for combinatorial processing. Interestingly, when we looked at the time course of processing of these stimuli, we found something that looks like this, where the colors correspond to the four, oh, I'm sorry, there's 2 bars for each condition because it's broken down by whether they answered the reality check question correctly or not in a trial, because some reviewers saw that that would be something that will show a very different pattern, but it didn't. Anyway, so the 4 lines are now responses over the course of an 8-word long string of words or sentence or string of non-words. And you basically find that in all conditions except for the sentence condition, things sometimes go up a little bit and then go flat, sometimes a little more, like in the word list it kind of goes up for the first couple words and then it goes flat. But in the sentences it kind of keeps building as you process the sentence. And we were very intrigued by this because it's kind of the opposite of some effects that have been reported in the literature, which have to do with the time course of sentence comprehension. In particular, behaviorally, people often have observed that reaction times speed up as you read through the sentence or listen through the sentence if you have some measure that deals with auditory comprehension. And intuitively, the idea is that it becomes easier and easier to integrate incoming words into the representation you're building. So in ERPs, you will find a reduction in the magnitude of the N400 to each later word in the sentence. And this effect seems like something like the opposite, right? You get more neural activity as you move further along in the sentence. And so we hypothesized that it has something to do with building a richer semantic representation. There may be many, many possible ways to formalize how exactly this happens. I mean, one very simple way to think about it is you can imagine that when you're processing a list of unconnected words, you get some activation for each word, and then the activation dies out because you're not doing anything with it, right? When you're processing something that has a bunch of relationships between words, this reinforces the activation of each of those words, and then the net neural activity stays higher for longer. Yeah?
Just a quick clarification
Sure.
question. On the percent signal change in the B there, is that percent change from the previous word or from the beginning of the sentence?
Beginning of the sentence, everything is relative to fixation.
Okay, great, thanks.
And it's a high gamma, so that's a part of the signal in ECOG that people have argued correspond to neural activity based on the animal literature. Okay, so I thought that this we call it build-up effect descriptively. We thought that it's maybe having to do with constructing complex meanings. An alternative hypothesis, and one that was advocated, I guess still is advocated by people like Christophe Pallier, and a recent also paper from the same group by Nelson and colleagues, is that it has to do with constructing complex structures. And so, I generally tend to favor semantic solutions because I think we use language for communicating meanings, and so whatever is reflected in our physiology should probably be sensitive to meanings as opposed to some very abstract property of structural property of language. But anyway, so we were trying to, so this is kind of a little bit of a roundabout connection here, because actually when we designed this original experiment, it wasn't to directly test necessarily this idea of whether we construct complex meanings or complex structures. It was more to try to see how response, so in an effort to try to understand what it is that drives your language system to respond so strongly to phrases and sentences. What features of those stimuli do these regions like? We devised a few manipulations where we mess with the signal in various ways, we degrade it in various ways, and then try to see how that affects the strength of the response. And so one of the things we did was to take a bunch of sentences, so words are colored by a pretty gradient for no particular reason. Well, not quite. You'll see as you get later points in the later points in the slide. But for now, just think of it as a gradient, right? It's just a naturalistic sentence from a corpus, and then you introduce a local swap somewhere. So you choose some pair of words and at random swap them around, and so you get to this kind of local blip where two words now appear in the wrong order. And you can imagine iterating that so that eventually, with a bunch of local swaps, you end up with something like shown in the very bottom, right? They're last on they overwhelmed, were they farewell by messages and gifts. So I think that's not a great sentence of English. And I was curious to see how the strength of the response would be modulated by the level of this kind of degradedness, because people have kind of done either the extreme things where you look at unconnected lists of words versus a sentence, or very subtle things like having an agreement violation, but not necessarily this gradient. Okay, so I was expecting some kind of a drop-off to happen in the language regions, and it didn't. What you find is that even at these extreme levels of scrambling, you find responses that are as strong as they are to veridical English sentences, and very different, much higher than, for example, the response to lists. So red is a list of unconnected words now, that's your baseline, and purple is a list of non-words, okay? So you really don't see this gradient fall off, which was striking, and that's why we ran this experiment a few times, because I thought that this can't be the case, that these two stimuli elicit as strong a response. And then I thought, okay, well, given this change in how I was thinking about language, that maybe things really have to do mostly with meaning, maybe what the language system cares about is the ability to be able to put things together into complex meaning representations. And as long as you have some local evidence for doing this, you get your maximal, you get the system kind of going to its max. And I should say that it's not the case that the brain is not sensitive to this manipulation. There's regions outside of the language system, the system that I argued and showed that was specialized for processing language. There's regions that care about general difficulty of tasks that show a gradient increase in response as you scramble things more. Okay, so it's not like there is, the manipulation sucks and no part of the brain cares. Yeah?
And was this presented auditorially or visually?
This is visual.
And together?
No, one word at a time. In this case, it's a serial word-by-word thing too, which we normally do to imitate auditory stuff. We should run some version of this in the auditory modality, which, I don't know, maybe you're getting to that question from afar, but let's leave that for a little bit later. So then one thing, so to test this notion that you need some locally I mean, it's not, yeah, semantically coherent information to get you the maximal response in the language system. What we did was, in one of the follow-up experiments, we tried to maximize distances among content words that usually go together. So basically, minimize local mutual information in context of in a formalism of information theory. But effectively, you can think of it as taking any two content words and trying to place them as far as possible within the span of 12 words. And so then you get something like this. So here's where the color gradient becomes helpful. I think I like colors very much. You can see that words that are colored in similar colors are quite further apart than in the others' local scrambling conditions. And so we call this local low mutual information condition. And indeed, if you measure pointwise mutual information, you get a big drop from the most scrambled condition in the first experiment to this condition, and it basically approaches that of the level of unconnected list of words. And this is, I meant to replace with the later data. It's a little bit more noisy here, but you get effectively the same thing. You don't get a gradient fall off, but the condition which has local minimized mutual information now drops effectively to the level of unconnected lists of words. And presumably the span within which you need some evidence that things might go together is constrained by something like working memory span or something like that. And that may be a little bit where auditory modality might be relevant, because that span might be quite different for acoustic representations, but I'm not very sure, we haven't done that. So, so basically, what I think these results tell us is that the structure of a sentence doesn't seem to matter for eliciting the maximal response in a language system, where you operationalize maximal as a response to a preferred stimulus, like a sentence. Like that's what this system most prefers. And so intuitively, it seems like as long as you can reconstruct some complex meaning locally, and I think there is important work to be done to understand what it is exactly. Is it just that there is at least one possible complex meaning that's possible? Is it some number of meanings that might be possible among words within some span? Like I think there is some formal and behavioral useful work to do there, but basically something that allows you to start putting words together into complex representations within some span of words seems enough to drive this system. And failing that, the response drops to the level of word lists, presumably suggesting that you're no longer trying to combine things together. And what exactly determines the likelihood of trying to put any two words together is a big question. I mean, I think there's probably a lot to do with our previous linguistic experiences, like whether we have combined those words together or seen them combined together. There may be some intrinsic properties of concepts that place constraints on how things combine or not. I think, again, there's a lot to be figured out there. So that's that for the meaning being potentially more relevant to this specialized language system than structure. Oh, and I should say that this is all very much in line with work that started with Witt's work here locally, and then got transformed into what's now talked about as the noisy channel models of language comprehension, where basically we seem to have a lot of tolerance for the signal being messed up in various ways, as long as we can recover the meaning. So we have a lot of faith in people communicating useful messages to us, and we just go, and that's why we can understand foreigners, and that's why you were able to understand this talk. I mean, I hope it hasn't been that bad, but you know, we can understand kids who don't quite have the grasp of the ordering of the morphology, but to the extent there's a coherent message, it seems like that's all that the language system mostly cares about. I don't want to say all, but it seems like that's a big driving force. And so then in the last couple of minutes, I'll just mention this work that's just come out on trying, I mean, it's a very, very, very early first step to try to understand what is the nature of concepts and linguistic meaningful representations. And so as you probably, as if you've come across this literature at all, you know that in all current natural language processing models, people use these distributed models of meaning representation. So the idea is very old, it dates back to the 50s and even earlier, but 50s is like the first attempt to actually construct such representation. The idea is that words that are used in similar linguistic contexts co-occur with similar words or similar in meaning. Very simple idea, very powerful. Turns out that constructing representations that take into account these different patterns of co-occurrence in language do really well on all sorts of tasks that can predict behavioral similarity judgments, including even on paraphrases of phrases and sentences, and solve kind of reasoning problems based on language. So there is something that these representations do really well. And the question that we started out with here is trying to see whether we can use these kinds of representations, whether these kinds of representations are basically a plausible way in which we represent meanings in the brain through trying to decode linguistic meanings from neural activity. And the kind of first effort in this direction was made by Tom Mitchell back 10 years ago. Now it seems like this just happened, but I guess time flies. So what they did was just take a bunch of concrete nouns. It was like a 20 or 30 concrete nouns and a set of 25 verbs. And the meaning of each concrete noun was basically frequency of co-occurrence with each of those 25 verbs. So it's a very, very simplistic model of a very simple subset of concrete nouns. And then basically you try to learn the mapping between brain activation patterns and these vectors of co-occurrences with these different verbs. And all the verbs were sensory motor verbs, like eat, which will co-occur a lot with apple but not with strain, or ride, which will co-occur a lot with strain but not apple, and so on and so forth. And you basically do okay. I'm just going to keep this over. And so this, in recent work, we're basically trying to scale this up and do this in a little bit more principled way. So ideally, of course, we have to represent meanings not just of a few concrete objects, but of also verbs and relational terms and adjectives and so on. And so the one, I think, useful insight we had was that, ideally, like, how would you decode any meaning of a new phrase or a sentence? Well, ideally, you'd want to take all the words in the language and train a representation for each of those words. But of course, that's not practically feasible. And this work has been led by Francisco Pereira, who is now at NIH. And basically, what you can do is you can take your whole lexicon and then we spectrally clustered. There's a few other clusterings that probably would work just as well. We clustered into a few regions of the semantic space, and then we sampled words from each of those regions to basically cover the semantic space quite exhaustively. And yet sparsely in a way that you don't have to train on all the words in the language, right? So we narrowed down to a bunch of, to like 200 stimuli, and then training, and these spanned, of course, nouns, verbs, adjectives. I mean, they're like, the idea is that they cover the whole of semantics in some way or other, all possible meanings. Right, I said that. And then we've trained a decoder on the mapping between one particular representation of these word meanings coming from out of Stanford NLP group GLOVE vectors. I mean, it worked similarly with other similar representations. You already did this. And then you basically train, you infer, but through training you infer a mapping between a pattern of brain activation, so differential activity in different parts of the brain, and differential loadings on the different semantic dimensions of different words. And then having done that, you then test, you get brain activity from a word that hasn't been in the training set, and you see how well you can figure out what that word is effectively. And so you can do this quite well for single words, but kind of more excitingly, we then tested this decoder on 2 sets of new sentences, okay? So we constructed a whole bunch of diverse sentences, and people read those sentences, so now they get a sentence at a time. And because I really didn't think this would work, the materials were constructed in a very hierarchical way, from very core semantic topics, so there's sentences about birds and sentences about skiing and bone fractures and whatnot. And then within each of those topics, there's 4 paragraphs about, say, a different musical instrument or a different bird. And then within each of those paragraphs, there's a bunch of sentences about a violin and a bunch of sentences about a pelican or whatnot. Okay, and I thought, well, maybe we can decode this very coarse level semantic kind of topic representation. There's just some simple stimuli there, but yeah, there are like Wikipedia style materials about different things. And these are the 3 levels of decoding. So the highest one is obviously the coarse semantic topic, but you really do pretty well even distinguishing between, say, 2 sentences about an accordion, which you know, I found quite striking. So this work, I think, just basically tells us that there is some neural plausibility to these kinds of representations. I think it's still incredibly unsatisfying because the kind of vectors that do really well in a bunch of behavioral tasks, they have dimensions which are not interpretable. Right? There's 300 dimensions in this high dimensional space. You know, I'd like to understand how concepts, like how that space is structured. Like, do we have some, you know, few key dimensions that cut through that big conceptual space? Are some concepts represented in some parts of the brain or some systems and others in others? And we're now trying to build on this. We're starting to get at these kinds of questions, which I think where the real exciting stuff is. Okay, so basically we have just a few take-home messages. We have a set of regions that we still don't really know what they do, but we do know that they don't just deal with any hierarchically structured stimuli, for example. They seem to be specifically attuned to processing linguistic, meaningful and structured representations with a stronger emphasis on the meaning of the message. It doesn't seem like there's any part of that system that's selectively or even preferentially, like a little bit more strongly than lexico-semantic processing. That was not a sentence. There is no part of that system. I have a 6-month-old baby, so all bets are off for how my brain works. No part of that system has any chunks that respond even a little bit more strongly to combinatorial or syntactic processing than lexico-semantic processing. The other bias is detectable in some parts. It seems like semantic composition is something that's enough to drive the system to its full extent, which I think is a big important hint about what the system is doing, but again, a lot remains to be worked out to get to kind of mechanistic level accounts of how that's happening. And then with respect to actually trying to get to meanings, I mean, I think we're still at the very early stages of you know, having some formal machinery to be able to try to connect what we've learned from, you know, work that guys here have been doing on concepts, to try to link that to some of these formal representations that can be on the one hand integrated into the, say, parsing models of language, which many of which, as we've talked about with some students here, are largely devoid of meaning, right? There's models of syntactic complexity that don't have a meaning component. They just care about how far 2 words are or how syntactically surprising an element is. Ideally, we'd want to have meaning be part of those models. Anyway, so it seems like these distributed representations are plausible, but I think that's not, I mean, it's exciting, and that's why you can publish these papers in sexy journals, but I really think the meat is in trying to now take this information and do something useful with it, like understand whether there are some core dimensions of meaning that, say, span abstract, concrete nouns, verbs, and adjectives, so whether it's more organized by the type of meaning or what. Okay, thanks. I think I'll stop here and I can answer more questions.
So, going to your first bullet in your conclusions there about this areas being selective for language and really you state very confidently nothing else, for example, definitely not music. Can you go back and sort of take us through a little bit about the methodology that supports your confidence there?
Yes, yeah, definitely not music. I am confident in that. There is one thing that I'm not confident in, and I can talk about that, and that's conceptual representations that are non-linguistic. But music I'm very confident in. Here's what you do. You find regions that respond to language. Right? It's a lot of stuff in the brain. they respond a lot when you process language. So it's reasonable to think that those regions care about language processing in some way. And then you look at how those regions respond to music. And forget even like subtle manipulations of structure or something like that. Just look at the response to music relative to lying in the scanner and looking at a blank screen. And the response to music is pretty much at that level. It's as strong when you're processing a complex, rich symphony as when you're looking at a blank screen. So at least, I mean, okay, to the extent that you make the standard assumptions that people in the imaging community have made about interpreting levels of activation as a region, being engaged in a particular computation or not, to me that says, okay, these regions really don't do much when we process music.
So what you're saying, there's no overlap that you've seen?
There's no overlap in this language system. So if you find regions that respond to language and then look in that system, there is no parts that care about music, but there is parts of our brain that respond in a very general way to demanding tasks. So some people postulate up to 3 systems there, some people just call it one big system. It's basically a set of regions spanning frontoparietal cortices known as the executive system or the control system or the multiple demand system. And a lot of the manipulations that people have used to look at music, to argue for music and language overlap, have used violations paradigms. So you get a piece of melody and then something that violates the tonal expectations, or you get a sentence and a violation in the structure of the sentence or something like that. And some of those manipulations overlap within that very domain general system, but it's not interestingly selective overlap between language and music, because any other demanding manipulation, even something that has nothing to do with hierarchical structure, will also activate those regions. So presumably this reflects something like generic attentional demands, revising our beliefs about what the world must have been, given that we've got something that violates our expectations. So something very, very cognitively general. And in fact, some of the papers that have argued for music-language overlap, you will see that they incorporate some control conditions sometimes, which is good. And sometimes there will be things like violations of timbre, right? So the structure remains the same, but a critical note is played by a different musical instrument. And it's clearly added as a control condition, and yet the results look pretty much the same for that condition as they do for the musical structure violation conditions, in line with this notion that whatever overlap you see is this very kind of general, attention-grabbing thing, violated expectation thing, however you want to formalize that executive process.
So just to summarize, you're saying if you do a kind of a region of interest analysis based on the areas that respond to language,
Yes.
and you don't have a particular task, you just have people listen to music, you see no.
You can have a task. I mean, you can have people make judgments about music. It doesn't have to be passive listening. I mean, I think passive listening is in some way kind of most ecologically engaging, and that stimulus will produce very robust selective responses in parts of the auditory cortex. So that was a paper by Norman Hagnier that showed there's actually selectivity for music in parts of the auditory cortex, very robust. It's just the language regions don't seem to do anything during that. Go ahead, go.
Well, okay. I'm very sympathetic, as you know, to the broad direction you're going. I think it's really interesting. In a certain way, it's a case that how much people here are aware of this long development in linguistics that moved from a point of view that really tried to say there's a special syntax and then there's this other thing, which is the lexicon, and then a kind of long argument about which is right that I think has been more resolved within linguistics in favor of this lexicalist point of view. So that's really interesting because up to now I haven't seen psycholinguistic work that sort of strongly comes on board to help that argument. It's kind of more at the abstract level, so that's kind of cool that you're actually getting results that seem to align with that very plausible realization. Let me make one sort of supportive but further leading comment and then one challenging question.
Please.
Because I want to make sure it gets asked.
Yeah.
But the supportive one is that I think you're, there's a part of the picture that might sort of galvanize it even more or sort of fill it out, and that's you're not talking very much here about neural resonance or about the dynamic behavior of the neurons just more saying, is it going on here or is it
Yeah.
not going on
Yeah.
here? But if you want to get at these phenomena like that interesting result where you showed that all the conditions sort of stayed the same even as you started very
Yeah,
low,
yeah,
where up to a certain point where it dropped off,
Yeah.
and that's where you kind of radically removed the
Yeah.
structure.
Uh-huh.
Then I think that's where you want to be looking, because it looks a lot like a phase transition, and it looks a lot like a
Mhm.
situation where what's happening is some kind of coming together, is succeeding in all those conditions
Mhm.
that measure essentially the same, and then at a
Mhm.
certain point you
The
break
collapse.
that
Yeah.
possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I think the part of the
Mhm.
picture you need in order to explain
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of things.
Indeed.
So, and
Yeah.
there's of course, as you know, a bunch of brain work developed in that,
Yeah.
coming
Yeah.
out of Popo's lab and a lot of other
Mhm.
places, so
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
seems valuable.
Yeah.
But here's my question that's more challenging
Mhm.
about this. You've gone at this by identifying the language, so-called language network, which seems like a plausible approach. And yet there's this whole research literature on Broca's area and things that point to Broca's as being very special in its role in getting at structural things. And I kind of just don't, I'm trying to understand, how do you connect all those findings, which seem to say Broca's area is very specialized for these structural things, with what you're finding? You don't even mention that area specifically in this.
Well, I mean, it's certainly so. There is one big problem. Thank you for that question. One big problem with the wording of the questions that it mentions Broca's area. Broca's area is not a useful it's not a unit of anything. It's a very rough anatomical location that people have pointed to. There's a nice paper in Brain and Language, making that point very clear, that people use very different things when they talk about Broca's area. It's a big chunk on the inferior frontal gyrus, basically. So there is multiple issues there. So one is that what people refer to as Broca's area has some subparts that are very selective for language, and some subparts that are part of this very domain general system that respond to any kind of difficulty. So a lot of manipulations of syntactic complexity, like for example looking at long distance dependencies, like a lot of Angela Friedrich's work, uses complexity manipulations. And so some part of what they may be detecting are part of that very general system that responds to effort across the board. Moreover,
Same as for the music.
yeah, the violation thing. But we actually, so we've looked at syntactic complexity. You do see sensitivity to syntactic complexity, but it's not focal in Broca's area. So we find it very robustly in the part of our definition of language networks, the language network that contains Broca's area, and that region indeed responds to syntactic complexity, but so does everything else. And so we have a paper which is called something like distributed syntactic processing or something like that. And in fact, if you look even in the papers of people who argue for focal Broca's area representation of some syntactic processing, they'll often, even in their nice meta-analysis, they'll put a picture up and they'll have a bunch of blobs in and around inferior frontal chunks, and then they'll have a bunch of blobs in the posterior temporal chunks, and they'll say, oh, we find these two foci, but this is doing the core structural work, and these are doing something else, based on no evidence whatsoever, as far as I can tell, in terms of based on speculation that these regions do different things. If you look at the patient literature, so there's actually a very nice paper, which you probably know, by Dick and colleagues back from 2001, reviewing the patient literature on syntax versus lexico-semantic stuff. And they reviewed the literature, and basically it doesn't seem like all of these pure syntactic deficit cases are quite as pure or quite as linked to a particular brain structure. So I think if you take the evidence as a whole, even the evidence that was used to argue for specificity, I think it doesn't hold water on the whole. Like if you rigorously go through and take it in tandem, I don't think there is strong evidence for focal region doing something, Yeah, I mean, I also mentioned that to the extent that some people have argued that some parts of that region evolved in humans to do something specifically complex to do with grammars, and that doesn't seem right. So in other primate brains, you don't find any parts of that part of the brain that seem qualitatively distinct. To the extent that you find newly emerged regions, they seem to be the frontal polar regions, which have to do with the ultimate hierarchical
So do you
control.
see it, is it a sociological phenomenon that the field has become so enamored of Broca's area? It's just somehow people start saying that's supposed to look and
Yeah. I think that's part of it. I think people like, I mean, a lot of people like the idea of a syntactic module. I mean, there's been a lot written about how syntax is a special part of language and nothing else matters, right? There's a whole tradition making that point and arguing that language is not for communication, and I think that's been misguided. I think meaning is a really big part of language, and it's you know, it's not to say the structure is not important, but I mean, I also think just from basic computational considerations, I just don't think you would build a system where you have your combinatorial machinery separate from
Right.
where you store the units that you want to combine.
Right,
I mean, I
I
think
think you still want to say structure is happening, it's just you're claiming it's happening in a kind of distributed
the distributed way, exactly. So I think that that combinatorial operation, whatever you want to call it, is instantiated throughout the cortex now, and it may be actually the same kind of operation that operates on combining language representations as it does on visual representations or music representations. Like, it doesn't have to be distinct, like even the same things, even if it's implemented in these circuits that store different kinds of knowledge representations that we've gained from our experience of the world or something. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No,
did
that
I-
Ani go first.
Okay. Gentlemen.
First, thanks. I really enjoyed that, and I'm delighted you're coming over to the side of meaning. I think that's
Meeting's
great.
good.
But I think my question actually that leads is led into by the discussion of the sum of the width. So
Mhm.
your language network is big, a lot of stuff, a lot of
Yeah.
area there.
Yeah, yeah.
And are you saying that you think it's all of it's doing pretty much the same thing, or do you think different parts of it are doing different things?
I don't know. I used to think that different parts do different things, and I have so far, using fMRI, I have failed to see clear dissociations. In very recent work, the first time I saw clear dissociations between left hemisphere and right hemisphere language, which is like a very clear double dissociation for a particular manipulation. Up until then, I haven't even seen that. For like all sorts of manipulations that people have used historically in the literature, you basically find a very similar profile and just slightly varying levels of overall activity. But critically, and in some papers, in a group analysis, those may emerge as like two focal points, but with enough power, you actually see the same patterns throughout that cortex. And so it does look distributed. That said, I don't think fMRI is the best method to look at that question. That's why we're trying to look more to ECOG, because I think temporally things might dissociate. Whether it's doing the same thing, I mean, I had a lot of discussions with Nancy Kamisher, who trained me a bunch of years ago now, and she was saying, how can this be? You know, look at the visual cortex, it's so nicely organized, and across the different features, and you're gonna go through this. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe vision is very different from language. And then just in the last year or two, I spent a lot of time talking to Emilio Bizzi, who is a motor control researcher. And he basically is, he's now worked on motor control for a bunch of years. And he also doesn't find the kind of selectivity by effector, for example, in the motor cortex. And in fact, selectivity that people have reported as being, cells that being selective for motor control of a particular kind of a thing, you test them a couple days later and they'll do something very different. So there might be some local selectivity that is misleading in some ways. I don't know. So I think what may be the case is that the hypotheses that people have had may not have been the right generalizations to cut that space up. Maybe it's organized by different kinds of meaning. I think another important thing to keep in mind is that it is a big chunk, and I see myself coming full circle, like when people started out with the aphasia literature, it's like, okay, there's these two areas, right, and they're doing language, and then people started doing imaging, it's like, oh look, there's whole stuff in between, going all the way to the temporal pole and other parts of the frontal lobe, and it's so extensive, right, it's the Binder, had this paper in '97, it's like an extensive language network, and yet, you go and talk to neurosurgeons, and I've been doing more and more of this ECOG and STIM work, and they're like, yeah, I can cut off like any part, from Broca forward, or any chunks of the temporal cortex forward if it's cortical, and the language seems fine. I mean, you'll see like a local decrement for a few days, and then it recovers. And so there's still something that's inherently more causally important in the more posterior temporal parts, and in some parts of the frontal cortex. So I'm kind of, okay, so whether those things that are causally important versus not doing the same thing, I don't know. Whether there's redundancy, probably. There's bound to be a lot of redundancy in our brains. We have like so much space in there. And I'm just like always so amazed at all these neurosurgeons who cut out so much stuff and people are fine. So there's bound to be either redundancy or very quick recovery. But even so, like if we had only one place where we stored a particular kind of meaning or something like that, then we would end up with very different kinds of deaths as opposed to quick recovery and basic. Anyway, so I don't know yet. I mean, I'm coming from training where I'm biased to think that it can't be the case that so much tissue is doing similar things. On the other hand, if you consider kind of usage-based models, for example, of language, I mean, that's kind of how they talk about language as a big set of stored knowledge representations. Like, I mean, I don't know. I'm starting to change my priors a little bit, but I don't think we know yet. But I think the strong claims about clear dissociations need to be taken with a little bit of salt. Jerry.
So I really enjoyed this, and not least because I didn't expect you to conclude what you've been concluding. So that's been lovely, and I shall use you as an example to my students of how people can start out thinking they're going to find one thing, and they find another, and they change their thinking. So that was great. But there's one thing that I'm finding puzzling here, and it's a challenge. So it's either challenging, if I can articulate it well, or it's not.
Okay.
So when I think about meaning and the traditional sensomotoric approaches to meaning, I think of meaning as being just all over sensorimotoric cortex, so it can be posterior, it can be motor cortex, visual, olfactory, whatever. Okay. Let's pretend just for 1 minute that those areas are not part of the language network as you've identified them. So then the question is this: why is it that if meaning is there, what is it that this language network is doing that is so meaning-oriented? Because that's not where the meaning is. The meaning is somewhere else. Is there some kind of recurrence going on, feedback from these other areas that is then driving some sort of meaning-like representation here, the kind of thing that Lolly Tyler, for example, has been looking at?
Yeah.
Otherwise, do you see the challenge there?
Yeah.
But in a sense, it sounds like, well, maybe what you have is structure here, which is exactly what you're saying there isn't here, because that's what there is. If meaning is somewhere else, what else is there in language but
well, I mean, there's forms, right? There's things that we map meanings onto to communicate, right? I mean, that stuff like the fact that a string table has to map onto some meaning. I mean, that has to be stored somewhere, and that's not structure. That's the lexicon, or some version of that. And so the question is indeed, and I'm spending a lot of time thinking about this now, is whether the kind of conceptual meanings, whether you hold the view that they're abstract or sensory motor distributed, kind of irrespective of that, whether that's outside the language system and you just have the links that, so you just store the forms in the language system and then the links are somehow implemented through the white matter tissue, or whether you have a redundant representation of conceptual stuff in the language system. I tend to favor the latter, in part because there's some meanings that are going to be really hard to express in sensory motor stuff, like all the abstract meanings, right? I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe you think you can do that with sensory motor cortices, but it's harder anyway. Also, the reason goes back to Ed's question on music, where I said there's one thing where I'm not confidently saying anymore that the language system just doesn't care, and this is, we do see some responses to meaningful non-linguistic representations. It's much lower than meaningful linguistic representations. It doesn't have the property of amodal semantics. It's not like, okay, here's a picture of an event, here's a sentence, and they elicit similarly strong responses. It's like, twice or lower, but it's stronger than a lot of other things like music and action perception and whatnot. And so this is like when you're watching silent films and we're processing pictures of objects and events. So it seems like there is some stimuli that can drive that system, and I think I've now convinced myself that we've ruled out the kind of boring cross-coding thing. So it's not the case that I show you a picture of a tomato and of course I'm going to activate the word tomato or something like that. Even using paradigms, for example, like those that Uri Hasson has used a lot in the last bunch of years, where you use the degree of synchrony across brains to estimate how stimulus-linked activation is, right? So I can put you in the scanner, I can put Evelina in the scanner, Whit in the scanner, and show you all a silent film, right? And then say, okay, I know that your visual cortices will all be going up and down together as determined by the properties of the stimulus, but is your language system also going to be going up and down together? Is it doing something consistent in processing this meaningful stimulus that has no language whatsoever? And it seems like it's not going together, nearly as much as when you're processing a story, but it's doing something that's way, way reliable. So there's some tracking of meaning that's not linked to linguistic forms.
So just as a follow-up to that sort of bolsters that from a theoretical perspective. So one of the people who you didn't mention as being a part of this tradition moving from grammar as rules into sort of lexico-syntactic grammars was Mark Steedman, and in his
Big fan.
categorical grammar system, he actually applied the same system to understanding affordances in the visual world and essentially combinations amongst objects and interactions.
Yeah, you won't believe it.
And-
Ted and I just had like that exchange like 2 days ago where I'm like, I should really try to connect with Mark Steedman's work more
So he's
because
got, I think he's only got one paper on that, but I thought it was very exciting because that would then actually fit very nicely with the view you've just expressed.
Yeah. Oh, and let me mention one thing because I think it's important. The global aphasics people, whose language system you take out and you can still do a lot of complex stuff, they can do semantics too, which suggests that there is meaning that lives outside of that system. So they can like make plausibility judgment. So there is definitely meaning outside of that. But we do see some response. So the system is doing something in processing linguistic meaning.
One last question? Thank you.
Thank you.